Good evening. My name is Catherine Biggscraft, and I'm the Executive Director and Curator of the St. John Jewish Historical Museum. Welcome to everyone in attendance tonight, in person and via Zoom. And just note that we've chosen to record this evening's event for posterity and to share it with others on our YouTube page once it's edited. When I started this project to celebrate the Jewish writers, it seemed like such a simple thing. List the writers who came from the St. John Jewish community, write some biographical notes, and choose a piece of their writing to share. The list grew quickly, and I've discovered many more writers than I thought existed. There were novelists, journalists, poets, academics. Some wrote only a few things, and there were others who were very prolific, especially the journalists. Then I decided to have some other people help with the reading. And although you, all lived in St. John in your younger years, all of you now live much farther away. But thanks to Zoom, we can have you join us and share some of your work. So after all the work over the winter, well, now I have enough material for tonight and probably one or two more nights. So don't be surprised if there's a part 2 event at some point later in the year, just so I don't leave anyone out. Some of the other writers that are on the list will be represented on a guided walk through the Kashetsky Cemetery on Tuesday, June the 16th, beginning at 7:15 until about 8:30. And that's under the banner of David Goss's Summer History Walks and Talks program. So if you're around, I guess for those of you who are here in person, you can come and hear some more stories. But tonight, we're only going to focus on 8 of the 18 writers that I've found. And we're pleased to have all of you here or a family member to stand in to read the works for you. So this reading selection includes personal stories. We've got art history, news, commentary, fiction, poetry, and drama. So there's a lot. At the end of the program, I'll invite our friends to stay on Zoom and perhaps entertain some questions from the audience, both those that are here and those of you who are online. And for those of you who are here in person, we do have some cookies at the back and water, and some of the books that we'll be talking about are also available for sale at the back of the room. And we have a little display up here at the front. Most of these are authors that aren't represented tonight, but just gives you an idea that some people are pretty darn prolific. So we'll get started. And we'll start the evening with Diane Koven. And I'll just do a little introduction for each person. So Diane is the daughter of Jerry and Marcia Koven. After she graduated from St. John High School in 1968, she spent a year in Israel before going to university. She studied English literature at Carleton University and media communications at Algonquin College. She settled in Ottawa and spent part of her career as a financial planner. She was the Ottawa correspondent for the Canadian Jewish News for over 20 years, writing mostly human interest pieces, and in 2013 published Who Am I Really? Adoption Stories, a book inspired by her own experience as an adoptive parent. So please welcome Diane as she shares a reading from her book.
Thank you, Catherine. The book was only very partially inspired by my own personal story, but there is a connection. So for those of you who haven't seen it, I don't know if there's a glare. This is what the book looks like. And it's a collection of true stories of people who were adopted. It's not the parents, it's only the adoptees, all of whom either searched for or were searched for by their biological families. Some had success in finding them, others did not. Some of the reunions were happy, others were not. But they're all extremely interesting. There are young people, old people, male, female, Jewish, not Jewish. I strove for variety in the stories and in the people. I had so many recommendations for people to interview. I didn't do any internet searching or any real research. I just mentioned to people that I was speaking to that I was writing this book, and the names and stories flooded in. So I spent several years working on it because I spoke to most of the people, and then I narrowed it down to get the variety that I did get. So it was a little difficult even to choose which one to read tonight. The stories are pretty short, but the stories are very long. It took a long time to get each one. So what I've chosen to read tonight is a story which I called Bought and Sold. High drama. The woman's name, and by the way, almost everybody was happy to have their real names used, which surprised me very much. The only people that didn't had originally said yes. One or two of them called me back later and said they didn't want to make their families uncomfortable, so they wanted to keep it anonymous. But everybody willingly gave me the permission to use their name. So this woman's name is Sharon Edelson. She actually lives near me in Ottawa. I had never met her, but I knew her next door neighbor. And the neighbor called me one night and said she was talking to her next door neighbor in the parking lot, in the driveway, and she had known her for years. And for some reason, this topic came up. She had no idea about Sharon's story, but she said, Diane, you must call this woman immediately. So I did. I met her, and here's the story I'm going to read from the book. Those of us who grew up in our biological families may wonder how it would feel to know we were adopted. But can anyone even imagine how it would feel to discover that you were sold to your adoptive parents? That's what Sharon and hundreds of others found out when they launched their searches for their biological families. Sharon knew that she had been born in Montreal and that her parents adopted her and took her home to another city the very next day. Growing up, that hadn't struck her as all that unusual, but she realizes now that taking a one-day-old baby on a train trip was not a regular occurrence. It was the stuff of cops and robbers, quite literally. Sharon discovered that she most certainly had been adopted through an international adoption ring, dealing in black market babies. The ring was active, using Montreal as its base of operations for a decade spanning the 1940s and 50s. It was huge, involving a network of doctors, lawyers, and social service workers, and millions of dollars changed hands. According to a newspaper account dated February 13, 1954, detailing how a sting operation had yielded a number of arrests, this is how it worked. A family wishing to adopt a child in New York would contact a lawyer there, who would subsequently refer them to the Montreal source. The couple would come to Montreal, and the financial details of the transaction would be agreed upon. Then the ring would obtain a baby from an establishment for unwed mothers. In some cases, the real mothers were given small amounts of money, but in others, the babies were merely taken without their consent. Once obtained, the baby would be delivered to its destination in the United States, usually in one of two ways. One was for a girl courier to literally smuggle the child across the border by bluffing her way past immigration authorities. The second method was by providing the baby with a visa and a passport that had been obtained here by falsification of names. Because there were no paper records, no proper documentation, and many people involved, there was no way to trace the children back to the biological mothers. As time went on and participants died or disappeared, it became completely impossible. Therefore, by the time any of these adopted children were old enough to begin an adoption search, the search was completely futile. In Sharon's case, this isn't just an interesting story and has not had a negative impact on her life or sense of identity. She's remarkably matter-of-fact as she relates the details to me on a sunny autumn afternoon in the kitchen of her cozy, beautifully decorated suburban home. Most of these couples were in their late 30s or 40s and had been unable to have children of their own, she said. My father was 40 when my parents married, and my mother was 36. I remember a book called Chosen Child, and I always felt special. It never bothered me being adopted. Sharon and her younger sister, also adopted, lived a very pleasant life with warm and loving parents. I had ballet and piano lessons. We had cousins in New York and went there often. We had an uncle who had a farm and we used to go there to swim. I had a very happy childhood, she said. Life progressed, and Sharon eventually formed her own nuclear biological family. After high school, I worked in administration at a local hospital for a couple of years, then got married and started having children, a boy and a girl. I always had a curiosity about being adopted, but never really asked my mother much because I didn't want to hurt her feelings. When my mother died, the first thing I looked for were papers about my adoption. It was the only thing I wanted. That's how I found out about the black market. I don't think they were doing anything wrong, said Sharon. They tried to help the unwed mothers who could not keep their children. It was illegal in Quebec to adopt across religious lines. Ironically, that law seems to be the basis for the success of the adoption ring. In those days, it was a big disgrace for unmarried French Canadian Catholic girls to become pregnant. Many hid their pregnancies or were sent away to care for an elderly aunt until the babies were born. They couldn't keep the babies, but often had nowhere to turn for help or support. On the other hand, because of the law that prohibited Jewish couples from adopting Catholic children in Quebec, it was also impossible for these willing, suitable couples to legally adopt these babies. It was a perfect storm, a black market waiting to happen. As word spread that babies were available in Montreal, couples from nearby New York, and then increasingly from other parts of the United States, were anxious to adopt them. Most of the couples were Jewish, as they were often unable to adopt through traditional channels. Sharon began her personal search in 1998 after her mother died. I knew then that I came from the Rabinovich Clinic because the telephone number was in my mother's telephone book, she said. She spent a lot of time combing the internet site of a group called CanAdopt for names that sounded Jewish or whose stories sounded similar to hers. And by Mother's Day of 1998, a group of 10 people with similar stories got together and met with a lawyer who they hoped would help them in their search. When we told him the story, he was flabbergasted and called an older member of his law firm who confirmed that the story of the black market adoption ring was true. Unfortunately, nothing came of that meeting, as the trail was definitely cold. Questions of who she really is do not haunt Sharon. She's well-adjusted, self-confident, and secure. Even though she knows that she was almost certainly born to a French-Canadian Catholic mother, and she was brought up in a Jewish family, she does not feel torn. My family always belonged to the local conservative synagogue, and we were never asked any questions about my origins. I was married in the synagogue, and it was always accepted that I was Jewish. Her hobby, really her passion, is genealogy. She has compiled family trees for both sides of her adoptive family and is constantly on the hunt for more information. And that is Sharon's story.
So thank you, Diane, for sharing this story. And if you want to read more, we do have some copies of Diane's book here. If people want to purchase one at the end of the evening. If by some chance we run out, Diane will be here in a few weeks and she can always bring more. So we'll move on to Sandra Paikowsky. And she was the daughter of Morton and Bessie Paikowsky and grew up on King Street East. She received her BA from Sir George Williams University, which we now know as Concordia, in 1967, and an MA in art history from the University of Toronto in 1970. She taught in the art history department at Concordia University from 1969 until 1910. And from 1981 to 1992, she was the director-curator of the Concordia Art Gallery. She was also the co-founder and editor of the Journal of Canadian Art History from 1974 to 2010, and is the recent co-editor of the Visual Arts in Canada, which is on our display at the front of the room, and the co-editor of the Beaver Book series on Canadian art published by McGill Queen's University Press. She is the guest curator of numerous exhibits and the author of art books, essays, and articles on Canadian art. She was made a member of the Order of Canada in 2015. And in 2023, she published James William Maurice, Paintings and Drawings of Venice, And 2 years later, an exhibition based on this book was presented at the McMichael Canadian Art Collection. Her husband was John Fox, and she was the co-curator and co-author of an exhibition and book, John Fox, A Painter in Venice, which was held at the Beaverbrook Art Gallery in 2025. So please welcome Sandra as she reads a selection from Away, the Carnegie Corporation, Walter Abel, and American Strategies for Art in the Maritimes from the 1920s to the 1940s, which was published in 2026 in the Journal of Canadian Art History. Sandra?
Thank you. It's such a kick to be here and to see you all after such a long time. Listening to Diane's wonderful story, a thought went through my head is so much of what we do professionally is really autobiographical. And to a certain extent, it's exemplified by the bits I'll read from this essay. And my first professional job was an assistant at the curatorial assistant in the Brunswick Museum in the art department. And I thought that I knew a certain amount about art in St. John. And a few decades later, I was asked to do an exhibition on Nova Scotia painting for the art gallery of Dalhousie Art Gallery. And all of a sudden, I realized I knew nothing and about the context of the art that I thought I knew something about, if that makes any sense. So this got me into just researching the prehistory, in a sense, or the history in the 30s and the 40s before things happened that I felt closer to. So what I'm going to do tonight and spare you, and you're not going to get the whole 40 pages, for God's sakes. This is a very edited excerpt which focuses on specifically on the creation of the Maritime Art Association, which was founded in 1935 and continues today as the Atlantic Provinces Art Gallery Association. It was begun by Walter Abel, an American art historian who came to Acadia University in Wolfville in the late 1920s through funding by the Carnegie Corporation of New York. The Carnegie gave enormous financial support to educational and cultural development in the Maritimes. And one relevant and shining example is the old St. John Public Library, which was paid for largely by the Carnegie. At Acadia University from 1928 to 1943, in the newly formed art department, Walter Abel's first arena for aesthetic advancement and cultural awareness in the Maritimes was his emphasis on the study of beauty rather than traditional chronological art history. His second arena was the Maritime Art Association, formed in 1935. A year earlier, Abel had obtained a small Carnegie grant to investigate, quote, what he said was the development of art interest in the Maritimes. It's not surprising that the corporation would support Abel, as it had already been funding American community art groups for over a decade. Abel envisioned the Maritime Association as an interprovincial exhibition circuit, and such, what he called joint action, would give more muscle to requests from maritime art groups, etc., to the National Gallery for loan exhibitions. And also he hoped that the Maritime Art Association would, quote, enable us to organize significant exhibitions of our own. Within a few months, and with funding from the Carnegie Corporation, Abel and Elizabeth MacLeod from Mount Allison announced the official formation of the MAA. It was the first Canadian regional alliance of art clubs and art groups, public schools, universities, social organizations, service and civic groups, artists, art students, and anybody else who is vaguely interested in art. The MAA's constitution was ratified at its first annual meeting held in St. John on the 28th of March, 1935, at the Admiral Beatty Hotel. Abel was easily elected the president. Its constitution was very straightforward, quote, to promote a knowledge and appreciation of art, to foster art activities in the maritime provinces through cooperative effort. And if Abel ever had a motto that he engraved on his forehead, it would be cooperative effort. The MAA attracted an impressive membership of 17 groups in 14 centers over 2 years, which is actually an astounding amount, a number of people. There's something vaguely called the Western Art Circuit, which was Vancouver and a bit of BC and a bit of the prairies, and they had nothing as organized or as huge as the Maritime Art Association. The creation of several local groups, such as the Fredericton and Charlottetown art clubs, was the immediate result of the formation of the MAA, and there's a lot more. But interestingly, the St. John Art Club, which turns out to be the daddy of them all, had been founded in 1879, which was kind of a shock to me to find out. Anyway, the National Gallery of Canada, in view of its superior resources and experience, loaned most of the exhibitions to the Maritime Art Association. While this allowed for efficient and regular programming in the Maritimes, H.O. McCurry, as he's always called, the National Gallery's then assistant director, primarily saw the MAA as another way to insist that the National Gallery was the one and only art institution in Canada, an attitude it maintains still today. That's an aside. McCurry's power over the activities of the MAA was further enhanced by changes in the Carnegie Corporation's support structure. Rather than monies coming directly from New York, its headquarters, to the recipient, Carnegie Arts funding was now channeled through the newly formed Canadian Museums Committee. This was because the reason for doing this is they were giving so much money to Canada. It's just astounding. McCurry, Harry McCurry from the National Gallery, was its main administrator. Dr. Clarence Webster, who is a stalwart of the New Brunswick Museum in St. John, was also on its board. The Carnegie Canadian Committee would provide a small annual grant to the MAA for almost a decade, although on occasion additional funding came directly to the MAA from the Carnegie, thanks to Abel's hat-in-hand visits to their New York offices. From the early years of the MAA, McCurry made demands and attached strings to his purse that went far beyond those ever exerted the Carnegie itself. Knowing that he was working for two masters, Walter Abel also regularly sent lengthy letters to New York so that its senior staff was informed of the MAA's achievements from his perspective rather than from only through McCurry's reports. The MAA's exhibition program of about 8 shows per year took pride of place. Abel shared the Carnegie belief that the exhibition was both an aesthetic experience and a venue for patronage by the public, as the artist had the right to make a living through exhibition sales. In the dirty 30s, any purchase of artwork from the Maritime Art Association shows or shows sponsored by its member groups would both validate Canadian art and hopefully provide a bit of income for the artist. The MAA annual exhibition, with its wide variety of regional artists and enthusiastic newspaper coverage, I mean, they were just the biggest fans, was its most successful strategy for creating the idea of a regional art community. Each annual had mimeographed information sheets on the artwork and included an essay, often by Abel. In the first of Abel's texts, he's strident on the emphasis of borderless aesthetics as exemplified by maritime artists. He makes no reference to Canadian painters outside the region. He makes no attempt to link trends in maritime painting to those in the rest of the country, nor does he make any reference to the nationalist implication of subject matter, like landscape, for which you have the nationalism of Ontario through the Group of Seven. More importantly, he does not position maritime art within the usual self-deprecating narrative of regional isolation. Instead, he discusses the artwork within the context of international art, thus paying the artist and the artwork the highest, the very highest of compliments. Opportunities for maritime artists to display their work in a regional forum could only have happened through the invention of the Maritime Art Association. Oddly enough, one bone of contention was Harry McCurry's attitude to the MAA. Despite constant invitations, he never attended any of the Maritime Art Association's activities, even though he was indirectly paying for them as being head of the Carnegie Canadian Committee. McCurry also demonstrated little understanding of the problems and complexity of an exhibition circuit in a region with only one art museum at Mount Allison and two multidisciplinary museums, St. John and Halifax. McCurry's criticisms of the MAA were based entirely on his wanting greater exposure and publicity for Ottawa shows during the tourist season. Abel had to remind McCurry that unlike institutions in Montreal or Toronto, most centers in the Maritimes did not have the resources, physical or human, to maintain a year-round exhibition schedule. And whatever the MAA did accomplish, it was done almost entirely by volunteers, particularly teachers, who went on vacation in the summer. Nevertheless, the National Gallery did provide exhibitions that otherwise would never have been seen in the region, even if they were displayed in halls, schools, library, gymnasium, department stores, hotels, any place that had walls. That's all they needed were walls. The successes and failures of the MAA during its first decade are intricate. As would be expected, local squabbles and regional jealousies abounded. The stories are just amazing of what they did to each other and said about each other. But particularly, there was a particular factionalism between Abel, who saw the 1940s as an opportunity for the role of art and artists in societies, while others, his opponents obviously, saw it as a period of the status quo or even pulling back. One conservative president of the MAA, Abel's successor actually, even went so far as to refuse funding from the Carnegie Canadian Committee, although they sent the money anyway. Other internal problems within the MAA rose from the diverse resources of the member organizations. Others were the result of ineptitude and basic stupidity. Still others came from Maritimers' long suspicion of people who come from away, who, like Abel, would never gain real acceptance. While the Maritimes had obvious ties to the United States, it also continued to privilege inherited British tradition and prejudices. That situation was exemplified by Abel's most vocal and unrelenting critic, Elizabeth Nutt, who was an English painter, British painter, and principal of what became the Nova Scotia College of Art and Design. Although their antagonism was largely a clash of egos, it's also appropriate to see it in terms of the tensions between the formidable Miss Nutt, and she's always referred to as the formidable, it's sort of like with a capital F, her old world neo-colonialism and Abel's American continentalism. Whatever their disputes, and they were long and nasty, the MAA created an agency for the promotion and dissemination of art in the Maritimes, and one that was absolutely remarkable for its time. Another principal instrument for cultural advancement by the Maritime Art Association was the creation of the Maritime Art Magazine, founded in October 1940 by Abel, and again with Carnegie Corporation's support. It was the first periodical in Canada entirely dedicated to the visual arts, and was actually outstanding for its unusual inclusion of the fine arts, crafts, which was thought to be like junk, crafts and architecture. The magazine, in some ways, would prove to be Abel's most lasting contribution to maritime art, and especially Canadian visual culture. What happens next under Abel's editorship, and how Maritime Art Magazine, in a period of 2 years, becomes Canadian Art Magazine, which endured for decades, is another story. But that tale is best told in my article in the Journal of Canadian Art History. Thank you.
There's a lot of history there.
There is. Just imagine if she had read the whole 40 pages. But if anybody wants to read the whole 40 pages, I do have them. As well as some of the other articles that she's written as well. So I don't know how many pages are there all together, but you know, it's a good stack. Hold my fingers up twice. So we'll move on to our next reader, who is Jan Zatzman Orlansky. And let me tell you, as you will discover, her experience is one that should be the envy of anyone, whether or not you have traveled the world. So Jan is the daughter of the late Charles and Ruth Zatzman and grew up in the family home on Douglas Avenue. She is now retired and living happily in Burlington, Vermont. She spent 22 years traveling the world with her husband, Michael, who was a diplomat in the United States Foreign Service. Together with their daughters, Tamar and Robin, they lived in, and here's a list, Jakarta, Indonesia, Accra, Ghana, Guatemala City, Skopje in North Macedonia, and Santiago, Chile. And they finished off their career in New York City for 2 years before retirement. And Jan worked in a variety of positions while she was in each of those posts. And it was an opportunity for growth and awareness of other languages and cultures, and gave their daughters confidence to navigate and adjust to new schools and environments. Tamar and her husband, who is also a diplomat, and they've been to, I'm not even sure how to pronounce this, we'll just say Mexico, Ganju, China, Yangon in Myanmar, Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia, and Sofia in Bulgaria, and are currently working in Washington, D.C. Robin is a history professor of East Asian studies, specializing in Japan, fluent in the Japanese language, and living in New York City. As for Jan, she graduated from the University of Virginia with a doctorate in communications and marketing. So I think you and Diane may have some things to talk about. Lost my spot. She's also been a teacher of hearing impaired children and adults. Wrote a book about teaching hearing impaired children in the regular classroom. Was a product manager for educational texts at a publishing house in Ohio. She's a trained calligrapher and a certified Zentangle teacher. I had to look that up. And maybe, Jan, you could explain what that is so we don't have the system crash and everybody pulls out their phone to Google it. So Jan does enjoy travel around the world into places they haven't been before. So like the 3 places left on the planet. And so she's going to read a story that she contributed to a book, Realities of Life in the Foreign Service. Her chapter is entitled Tales and Travails of Teenage Daughters in One Foreign Service Family. So Jan, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Catherine, and thanks everybody who's spoken so far. It's really interesting to hear your stories. So this is the book. I don't know if you can see it.
We can, yep.
Okay. And we just wrote one short chapter in it, and I'm even going to shorten it more than it already is, because I want to hear other people's stories. Tales and Travails of Teenage Daughters in One Foreign Service Family. This book actually has multiple chapters in it, each of which describes life in the Foreign Service. This one happens to be on families, but there's education, there's views from abroad, there's work and technology, there's an overview of Foreign Service life. As you can imagine, things have changed quite radically in the last few years due to the president and his demolition of everything that we worked very hard for. But that's another story. So I want to, the way we did this chapter was a kind of a point counterpoint. So everything that I wrote is in normal text, and then what they wrote is in italics. Of course, you're not going to see that, so I'm going to have to tell you what they said. Just as a little bit of a background, we entered the Foreign Service life when our daughters were 9 and 14 years, respectively. And the only other foreign travel, apart from visiting my family in Canada on vacations, was half year we spent in Zagreb, Yugoslavia, the former Yugoslavia, now Croatia, where my husband was a Fulbright scholar. The girls then were 3 and 8 years old. This experience proved to be a seminal one, because both daughters had positive memories of living in Zagreb and traveling around Europe. 6 years later, when we discussed the possibility of living overseas, they had only positive memories. We really didn't have to sell them the idea of leaving the security of their school, home, and friends. They were ready. And in some ways, they were more ready than their parents were. One misconception we had, meaning the parents, me and Michael, about the Foreign Service was that our children would become worldly and possibly make friends with local children. Well, they did become worldly, but they certainly did not make friends with the children in the countries we lived in. We were very naive about that. First of all, our children as teenagers and their friends rarely, if ever, became close friends with the children in the host country. Secondly, we have observed that teens tend to mix with those with similar backgrounds. So the Koreans stay with the Koreans, the Americans with other English-speaking teens. My observation is that the younger children mix more readily with a variety of children from other countries. As they mature, they mix more with those who share similar backgrounds. This is an unfortunate phenomenon, but being aware of it from the outset might help parents make choices that bring different groups of teens together. As I said, this book was written to help people who have joined the Foreign Service. So that's the voice that I'm using in this particular paragraph. Teens are trying to figure out who they are during this emotionally and physically tumultuous time in their lives, and it takes a secure and well-grounded person to reach out and make an effort to get to know someone on a personal level from another culture. As far as worldliness is concerned, our children do have a better understanding of different cultures than most of their American counterparts. However, because of the necessary restrictions placed on them as foreigners in countries that were not always safe, they were not able to take full advantage of learning from and interacting with people and cultures around them. So the next short portion is from our elder daughter, Tamar, and her reflections on what it was like. She only lived with us in one post because she graduated from the international school in Jakarta and then went off to college. So these are her recollections. She happened to meet her husband also at the Jakarta International School, which is interesting. She was only 15, and when she graduated, she went to one college, he went to another college, and then they got together eventually. So anyway. So Tamar says, I had a wonderful experience at the Jakarta International School, or as we call it, JIS. I met my 3 best friends and my husband there. I think that the friendships you establish while at an international school are stronger than others are because you have shared such a unique experience. I am as close as I am to those friends, not only because of the history we have together, but because we are able to relate to things that people who have not lived overseas would just not understand. There are certain foods or smells that may be very different to most people, but can take us back to a familiar time and place. The girls used to like to go to, street, what do they call them, like kiosks, and get food. And when they smell those smells now, like in major cities like in New York and Washington, they just gravitate to those places. And I think it's because of the experiences that they had. We understand that a foreigner in a third world country is not unusual to have maids or cooks. It was not strange to us to hop on a plane to visit our parents halfway across the world for spring break. This is when she was in college and when they were in college. We were Americans in a culture which was not our own, but one that on a certain level, we grew very comfortable in. I remember coming back to the States for the summer and feeling a type of culture shock at how bright and white and clean everything was. Now, this is having lived in Jakarta, which is a pretty grimy city, but endlessly fascinating. I grew to prefer the atmosphere of the third world because I had grown used to it. There is definitely such a thing as third culture kids. Now, I have a debate with my daughter on this because I don't truly 100% believe in that, because these kids, our daughters, would come back every summer and reacquaint themselves with their own culture. So I think it's pushing the point to say they're third culture kids, but anyway, that's her opinion. You can't claim to be part of the culture of the host country you're living in, but you also don't quite fit into the American culture. Well, I can buy some of that, but honestly, I think she's trying to make herself a little bit more different than she actually is. To some people, this may be an unsettling way to grow up, but in my case, at least, it allowed me to form amazingly strong bonds with friends who shared this lifestyle. So now this is my voice. Jakarta, Indonesia was our first post, where the Jakarta International School helped nurture both girls with an excellent academic curriculum and positive social outlet. They both thrived during our 3-year tour there. Since our elder daughter graduated from GIS, the first big decision that we had to address was where she would attend college. And this process began at the end of her sophomore year.
What do you make it dressing?
So this is our daughter, Robin, our younger daughter, talking about how she viewed life in the Foreign Service as a student. And she's doing it from when we were living in Accra. So she was 12, 13, something like that. These girls now are 51 and 46. So this is some time ago. Living in a greater hardship post can take on different meanings, from security risks to a lack of basic amenities. And in the case of Accra, it was the latter, namely a lack of good international schools. As an 8th grader, the quality of my education was not a particularly high priority. She's speaking from her point of view, but my overall quality of life was, of course, essential to my happiness. And she had a great time. She had a lot of friends and they enjoyed themselves. When people ask me today, what was the best country, Indonesia, Ghana, or Guatemala, those are the 3 countries she came to with us, that you lived in when you were growing up, I often reply with, I can't answer that because I was at such different stages in my life at each of these 3 posts. I had a fun year as a 13-year-old in Ghana, where the local people were friendly, the culture vibrant and exciting, and I had good friends to play with after school. I believe that if I had stayed there another year, I would have been bored. So this is my voice now. At the time, the Lincoln School in Accra did not have enough students to have a curriculum with many options. Our younger daughter was in need of more stimulation, and we had to find a school that would challenge her academically. And so she was applying for 9th grade and ended up in a school in Putney, Vermont, called the Putney School. It's an agro school where they grow their own food. They grow their own vegetables and fruits and have their own farm. So in addition to academics, she and her fellow students had to cook for themselves, each other. They lived in a dormitory, and that's where she spent 9th grade. Then we moved back to Washington, D.C., and for a short time to do what they call area studies. And we were then following a tour in Guatemala. And our younger daughter accompanied us to that post, where she completed grades 10, 11, and 12 at the international school there. Our next post will be without our daughters. That's I'm writing this in the past, but it seemed like the present when I was writing it. But an interesting twist to this story is that our son-in-law, along with our elder daughter and their baby daughter, is considering a career in the Foreign Service. Well, they've been in the Foreign Service now for 20 years, but that was what was happening then. The other interesting thing is that Robin, when she was at the Putney School, her roommate was from Japan, and did not speak any English. So when we brought her to Vermont to the Putney School and dropped her off and met her roommate, she just kept bowing to us and we kept bowing back to her, but we didn't have any words and Robin didn't have any words. In the meantime, Robin, as you heard from the introduction that Catherine gave, became a specialist in Japanese and speaks Japanese and is a professor of Japanese studies at CUNY in New York. So this is the last portion here. I guess the reason I told you that story is because oftentimes you don't really know what a child's education is, how it's going to affect them. And in our case, just having a Japanese roommate at Putney led to her now profession. And so I thought that was kind of interesting. So this is Robin, our younger daughter, speaking, and this is the final part of the chapter I'm going to read. While I know that spending my formative years, ages 10 to 18 abroad, had been a trade-off for not having close childhood friends and for getting tongue-tied at the question, where are you from? I believe that the benefits far outweigh the costs of my upbringing. The impact that growing up overseas has had on my life is ever present in my life as an adult. Having spent so many years living in exotic third world countries is not simply an experience that I can look back on as a phase in my childhood, but rather an upbringing which has effects that have permeated into all the veins of my life. When I was actually living abroad with my family, I didn't often think about the exceptional circumstances under which I was living. I went to school every day, participated in after-school activities, and hung out with my friends like teenagers in most countries of the world do. When people today ask me, wasn't it hard for you to move around so much? I explained that it was never particularly taxing on me because I would just accepted my way of life as it was without questioning the transcontinental leaps I was making every few years. Normally our posts were 3 years, some of them 2. Of course, I was aware that my counterparts in the United States were staying in the same place with the same friends that they'd had since nursery school. But the fact was that overseas, I was attending schools with people in similar situations as myself. This is not to say that moving away ever became easy. By the third move, I realized that the students and teachers in international schools were generally very accommodating to transferring students, and that I would always make at least a few close friends very shortly after arriving in my new home. So in many ways, it's easier for our children in the Foreign Service to adapt because they have a network of friends instantly. Whereas, I'm looking for help in the house. I'm looking for a job. My husband is all set. He's in his job. It's quite different for the adults in the situation. The impact that moving around so much has had on me shows itself now in my apparent inability to stay in one place for more than a few years. Well, that's since changed since she's had children. As is the case with a lot of Foreign Service kids, I'm considering a career in the Foreign Service or some other internationally minded organizations for myself. In fact, I write this composition from my current home in Japan, where I came to teach English directly out of college. Growing up overseas and moving around so often was clearly not traumatic enough to prevent me from pursuing a similar lifestyle of my own volition. The end.
I'll thank Jan for her sharing such a diverse and unique experience. And I'm going to add one other footnote to that because I'm going to sneak in another writer. Her late brother, Gary Zatzman, started out as a math teacher in St. John before he moved into journalism, and a career that also took him around the world. These Zatzmans don't stay home, I guess. And he became a self-taught expert on the law of the sea. And then he settled and researched and taught at Dalhousie University on energy resource economics and was the writer or co-author of 6 textbooks on this subject. And a couple of the titles, I mean, I don't know how thick these books were, but even the titles are heavy lifting.
They're thick.
Sustainable energy pricing, nature, sustainable engineering, and the science of energy pricing. Wow. The greening of pharmaceutical engineering. Something else he wrote called reconstituting the curriculum. So I don't have access to any of those books. I don't know that I'll put them at the top of my reading pile, but I want to recognize that some of these families, there's more than one writer in the house. So now we'll move on. We'll take a slightly different direction and we'll introduce Harry Rajchgot. Now, Harry only lived it for a very few short years in St. John, but we're still counting him because you were here. And Harry's experience is a little bit different because he was born in a displaced persons camp in Pocking in what was then West Germany after the end of the Second World War. His parents were Holocaust survivors who spent the war years in the Soviet Union before immigrating to St. John, New Brunswick, and then on to Montreal, where Harry now lives. And although Harry dabbled in writing as a young man, he began again when he was almost 50. His father's fatal illness at the time stirred him to try to make some sense of his fragmented knowledge of his parents' early lives. And this led to his first novel, Gravitational Fields. He has also published The Sweetness of Life, My Mother's Yiddish Cookbook, which we have here on display, so a little bit more of their Holocaust story. Harry's also been the co-editor of the Harvest HaAsif literary anthology. He's currently the editor of Jonah Magazine, which is an online literary magazine. And he amuses himself by writing musical plays for the Jewish festival of Purim as a founding member of the Green Writers Collective. In his day job of dentist, he has been a staff member of the McGill University Health Center. And his other St. John connection, other than having lived here, is that he is married to Cheryl Everett, formerly of St. John. And Harry is the father of 3 adult children. And he tells me he's going to be reading from one of his stories, I believe, The Graduate.
Okay, so I'm actually reading from another chapter from a book that I finished writing, but it's still looking for a publisher. It's called Volkswagen Man, and it's set in the late 60s, early 70s in Montreal, and the period of sex, drugs, and rock and roll at McGill University. And this is what I'm going to be reading is called Jessica Rosenblatt. It's a chapter about this young woman who comes to Montreal, and she's one of my in and out characters in the book. So here goes. Jessica Rosenblatt came to Montreal because she wanted to live in the United States. It wasn't misdirection. She did know the difference between North and South. She was just waiting for her green card. She had worked in Boston over the summer in Filene's, an upscale department store.
I made a mistake.
Why?
Sorry?
No, go ahead, Harry.
Her fun summer job was in its bargain basement, stocking the bins of new, week-old, and even older clothing, which hadn't yet sold, shifting them in an ordered manner, changing the tags and the prices. Sometimes she took a liking to a particular blouse or skirt, something still in style which would attract the acceptable boys at the dances she went to on the weekends. She kept her eye on the item as it migrated from the first bin by steps to the last. She pushed it to the bottom of the heap of clothing, but it didn't help. Some woman would dig around while Jessica squirmed. She suffered as the woman dragged it up and carried her find to the cash, and there Jessica stood guard if the manager wasn't near and pointed out the item's flaws. Sometimes this worked. She occasionally had to convince Filene customers Canada was a separate country from the USA when they asked where she was from and commented on her delightfully weird accent. Jessica had been born and grown up in the port city of Halifax in Nova Scotia, Canada, where her grandparents had first arrived as immigrants from somewhere in Russia, as her mother put it, full of hope and dread, eager to shed their stale clothing and their Yiddish language. Losing their old world accents, an impossibility, was left to the next generation. At Pier 21, they had been greeted, or rather allowed in, by an officious immigration officer who wanted to write a different name on their Canadian landing cards, Rose or Rosen or Rose Petal, but Jessica's grandfather refused. How would any relatives who might come later find out with such a name? Their last vestige of the old world. It didn't feel kosher. Her parents had sent her to Boston to study fashion marketing at an exclusive girls-only Cumberland school because they trusted the school to keep a tight rein on her and keep her safe. It was the late 60s. Sexual experimentation, drugs, and libidinous music was everywhere. Girls at other schools in Boston wore their sandals, miniskirts, and body-hugging T-shirts without a bra. They lit Zippos at rock concerts and guzzled beer. Jessica's school had strict rules. No alcohol or sign of it in the dorm rooms, and absolutely no male presence allowed. These edicts also mandated high heels, hats, and skirts below the knees whenever the girls were outside the dorm. She was the only Jew in her class now, after her so-called religionist, Sandra, made the mistake of repurposing an empty wine bottle, a sign of debauchery, as a flower vase and placed it in the window of her dorm room. She came back teary-eyed from a tense meeting with the director the following morning, and she disappeared from classes the day after that. When Gordon Lightfoot performed his decidedly Canadian songs in a club, he marveled that she knew the lyrics when he called out to any Canadian in the room to sing along. At the end of the first set, he called her forward and autographed the only piece of paper she had with her, a used train ticket to New York City. He shared a pastrami sandwich with her and offered her a beer, which she declined. Being both Canadian and Jewish gave Jessica an air of the borderline exotic. She aroused curiosity in her classmates and aroused the boys for other reasons. She began to go out with an Italian Catholic from New York whom she'd met at a party. To the extent that she could, she still kept kosher. It was Nick who initiated her to pizza with the works, among other delights. Pepperoni sausage under cheese was all new to her. Beer, too, which made her tipsy after a few sips, and the delights of sex. Jessica was not looking for adventure, but it often found her. She followed Nick's lead on a number of things. After a folk music concert in Greenwich Village, the couple rushed for the last train back to Nick's cousin's place on Long Island. Jessica looked down from the stairs, climbing up to the track, and saw a young man being knifed. Nick grabbed her and dragged her away and onto the train. Behold the real America, Jessica. The scene played itself in her head for months. After her first year, she spent the summer in Canada's big city, Montreal, where she believed things were less dangerous, working at Morgan's department store in the jewelry department. She didn't read the newspapers. One afternoon, a lady asked her, in French, to show her a watch. Jessica's French was rudimentary. Vous ne parlez pas le français, mademoiselle? Je m'excuse, madame, mais pas très bien. The woman switched to impeccable English. Where are you from, my dear? Nova Scotia, Halifax. How did you ever get this job? I just applied from Boston. I go to school there. Boston. So you tell me that you are from the United States and Nova Scotia, not from Quebec? You speak little French and you have this job? Yes. Here in this French city, Montreal, my daughter has tried to get a job with this business for 2 years and has been turned down all this time. She speaks impeccable French and English, but of course, l'anglais with an accent. This is outrageous. I'm going to call your manager and complain. No, I will call the company's président. What about the watch, madame? You must be joking. I'll look at Dupuis Frères, where they value our language. I should have gone there in the first place. You've heard of them? Of course, madame. Jessica had never heard of Dupuis Frères, a department store on the eastern side of the great Montreal divide of Saint Laurent Boulevard, with French spoken to its east, English to its west. It was a business favored by les Canadiens Français, the French Canadians. The company's vision stated, quote, in a country such as ours, submerged by immigration, surrounded by US, British, or Jewish financing, we do not have the right to be ordinary, mediocre, inferior, or to resign ourselves to the perpetual role of hero. Jessica kept her summer job despite the woman's complaint, but this incident became a cause célèbre among the Quebec media a few years later, misremembered as the infamous fat old English sales lady in the hat department at Eaton's department store, who could speak no French. That's the way things happen sometimes. Truth and untruth blended harmoniously over time, became part religion, part culture, and completely legend. Jessica, the thin young woman, became an abomination to French Canada, transmuted into a cultural shibboleth, dismissively and arrogantly unilingual English, and thankfully not remembered as Jewish.
Thank you, Harry. That's a great story. We'll look forward to reading the rest of it when it's available. All right, so we'll move. So we'll move on to Cheryl Everett. I don't think she's an author herself, but I'm prepared to be wrong. But she's going to share a piece of writing from her late brother, John Everett. So they were both the children of Samuel and Beatrice Everett. John graduated from St. John High School in 1959 and then went on to Mount Allison University. He was a staff writer for the Evening Times Globe newspaper in the 1960s. I found stories on the sports page, primarily in the beginning. He then moved on to becoming an editor of the paper in the 1970s, and then a reporter for Atlantic Insight, a news magazine that covered the maritime provinces. In 1982, he moved to Israel, changed his name to Dov Ivry, and while there published several reports, articles, and books. So please welcome Cheryl Everett Rajchgot as she reads from her brother's work.
Thank you, Catherine. My brother had a very long, controversial at times. It was very controversial in journalism. When he got to Israel, that did not change. He wrote approximately more than 60 books of a political nature. And I found over 60 articles on the Times of Israel. So if anybody wants to follow up and read some of his work, it's on the Times of Israel under Dov Ivry. But I decided to pick a human interest story, which has connections to St. John. And it's a light story, but it's sad also. It's called Are You Still Alive? And unfortunately, 2 years after this, he died. I'm going to read this now. Can you all hear me?
Yes. Okay. Yeah.
All right. When you are young, the question asked when you meet a friend is, are you going with someone? Mm-hmm. Several years pass and the question becomes, got any kids? At my age, the question, although unspoken, is, are you still alive? In the past few years, I lost 2 very good friends, and it makes you start to feel like you're in the trenches, with bullets flying in from all directions, hitting people to the left of you, hitting people to the right of you, and you know the bullet is approaching that has your name on it. I'm from a small port city on the east coast of Canada, St. John, in the province of New Brunswick. One fellow, I was friends with from age 5, 6. His father had gone off to the big war, never returned, and his mother, unlike many other war widows, didn't remarry, at least during the time he was growing up. He was rather phlegmatic. He didn't talk much, but when he did, what he said was worth listening to. Nietzsche said, "Against boredom, even the gods themselves struggle in vain." My friend could have given the gods lessons in how to deal with boredom. He spent his life taking up one challenge after another. When he was in his 30s, after his marriage had disintegrated, he quit his post as a school teacher and went to Toronto in Alberta, where he made himself a name and a living as a folk singer. I was flabbergasted by this. I had a rock and roll group back in the 1950s. He was often around us. He never once sang a note in our presence or gave any indication he could sing well. If I had known, I would have added him to the group. When I came out to Israel, I lost all contact with my former life in Canada until the internet came along and transformed the world into a global village. I was back in touch with my old friends. I came up on the internet in 2000 and had a site where I featured bizarre or highly unusual stories. One was about Misha de Fonseca, who said she survived the Holocaust after being taken in by wolves. Just want to make a mention here. He goes on a lot about the story. I edited it down so you get the bare bones. If you want to read the whole story, you can write me, and I'll be glad to give it to you. Her memoir claimed that a mother wolf cared for her like one of her cubs. The story became a huge bestseller in France and it was made into a film. She apparently taped an unaired Oprah show, and even Disney expressed an interest. There was a short-lived English edition. More later. Back to Dove's words. My friend A had for a time managed a sanctuary for wolves. In 2001, I told him about De Fonseca and asked him what he thought. "It's a fraud," he said. I asked him if he'd be so kind as to explain why he felt that way. "It's a fraud," he replied. End of discussion. I left the story up on my site. His verdict was only one opinion, even if it came from someone who had worked with wolves. What I didn't know then was that others had reached the same conclusion. A historian and a Holocaust scholar both warned the publisher that the book was fantasy. A genealogist later discovered that her real name was Monique de Vale, that she was born Catholic, not Jewish, and the events in the book had not happened. In 2014, a court ordered her to repay the publisher $22.5 million. So the book served a purpose. It gave younger readers a dramatic point of entry into the subject of the Holocaust without plunging them straight into its full horrors, but relates a gripping tale of a brave little Jewish girl and sympathetic wolves. I wouldn't categorize De Fonseca as a conscientious hoaxer capitalizing on the Holocaust. She seems to have believed her own story, having retreated into fantasy as a badly mistreated child. In any event, when the confession of Misha Monique was published, I notified my friend that he had been right all along and supplied him some details. Then I asked him, "Would you tell me how you knew?" He answered, "No." End of discussion. The name of our rock and roll group was the Asteroids. We were aged 15 to 17 when we started, and we made a record in 1958. We first talked about adding a pianist. Others recommended a fellow I was skeptical about because his background was classical, but he was sensational. We did a show when it was time for a piano solo. The legs and the hands were flying in all directions. He patterned himself after Jerry Lee Lewis, Great Balls of Fire. The crowd loved him. Back in the 1950s in Canada, you had no idea what was going on in the rest of the vast country. There was a 15-minute national news broadcast on TV, but most of it was politics. The local newspaper featured many local or world news. Rock and roll was strictly an American phenomenon. Any Canadians who made a name for themselves were recording in the US. Then circa 2005, music historians notified us that after researching the subject, they had determined the Asteroids had made the first rock and roll record in Canada. We had gained a footnote in history. One of the members of the group would become a prominent lawyer in Ottawa, the second a successful businessman, and the pianist had a hard life. There must have been a zillion songs recorded in the English language alone in the last 60 years, and a zillion singers and groups who made them, and almost all of them are totally forgotten. But because it became known that our record had been enshrined as a footnote in history, it got new exposure. And people started coming up to the pianist and asking him if he had been with the Asteroids. They wanted to hear him play. He hadn't lost a stroke. As a result, in his last decade, he had a lot of fun occasionally playing for an audience again, surrounded by young people. I never had the slightest interest in doing a Facebook page, but when the pianist died in 2015, I asked friend A if he would help me put up a page focused on the asteroids, primarily as a memorial to the pianist. Friend A and I had been chattering back and forth for 16 years, and we must have solved all the problems of the world. One day in 2016, he told me he was very ill. As usual, he was sparse on details. Then just before he went again to the hospital, he was upbeat. The doctors told him that they had new treatments which had a promising record of success. 2 days later, he was dead. His last words, as told by me, by his third wife, were in character, phlegmatic. He said to me, "It's time." A year later, the regional CBC did a fairly major item on air and in print on the 60th anniversary of our making the record, though technically it was the 60th anniversary of the founding of the group. We were invited to record because we had original material, which few others had. I did the lyrics, and that's where I learned I had a flair for writing, which became my livelihood in journalism. The A side was Blast Off, and the B side was Don't Dig the Algebra. The quality is poor because we did it with one mic and one take. We took turns doing leads on stage. On the records, I was background singer, but when we were invited to sing on TV, they chose a song where I sang the lead. You never know with these things. One day, my son, who is now in Europe, was texting with a girl who said that she loved 50s rock and roll. Since she grew up with me, he is familiar with many of the major performers and songs. So he asked her what she liked. She started stringing them off, and on the list was Algebra, Asteroids. He said, "Wait a minute, that's my father's record." She didn't believe him, though thought he was hustling her. He said, "He can tell you himself, he's still alive." My son dodged the bullets, but then again, so far have I. The guy to me who summed up life best was not a philosopher, but a country singer from the 1950s. There will never be another one like him. Hank Williams. He sang, "No matter how I struggle and strive, I'll never get out of the world alive." This is a funny song. He let life get to him, but the message typified the attitude of the 50s. Don't take life too seriously. Enjoy every minute. We've lost a lot of that attitude over time. Too bad.
That's great. Thank you.
You're welcome.
And so our last Zoom reader, we have a couple of other readings that we'll do with some people here in the room. They'll be a little bit shorter, but I'd like to introduce Ancil Kashetsky. Any longtime St. Johners will remember Ancil's weekly movie reviews in the St. John newspapers and how he may have influenced your decision to go out that night to the Paramount, to the Odeon, to the Parkway Cinemas, to Place 400. And I think there was one on the West Side in Lancaster Mall. I'm looking at somebody from the West Side who's nodding. So all of those theaters are now gone, leaving only memories behind. And now all we have is one giant multiplex. So Ancil is the son of Max and Blanche Kashetsky. After high school graduation, Ancil led recreation programs for the city and was a cast member of the Port City Players. I mentioned the newspapers. And of course, you didn't always agree with his assessment of the films being shown, but you knew which films were worth watching and which ones maybe you could pass on. He moved from St. John to Toronto in 1988. He worked for 20 years at the University of Toronto as a financial assistant and another 8 years at the Schulich School of Business at York University. And he didn't stop writing. He wrote occasional stories for the Canadian Jewish News on a wide variety of topics. Now, what I have in my notes, I think you may have changed what you were going to read, so I'll let you introduce your own piece, Ancil.
Okay, I'm going to preface my reading with just a few interesting facts. I'm reading a movie review of the movie Children of a Lesser God.
I love that.
It was filmed in St. John, and I'm sure Jan is aware of that because it involves, well, I call the Marley Matlin deaf, but I think the proper term is hearing impaired. But when I read this article, I'm going to read it the way I wrote it back in, I think it was 85, before, yeah, 1984, 85. But how did I get this job as a movie reviewer? You may remember that Moshe Kotler was reviewing movies for the newspaper. And when he left St. John to go to Montreal, he contacted me. I don't know, I forget why, but he asked me if I wanted to review. And I said, okay, I'll give it a try. And Fred Hazel hired me. And I worked maybe 5 or 6 years as a reviewer, and it was really enjoyable because I was paid for going to the, paid for doing something I liked. Anyways, I just wanted to mention that there is a strong Jewish connection to the movie industry in St. John. You probably all know that Louis B. Mayer was a pioneer of Hollywood, and one of the founders of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. He was from St. John. I think most people know that. Also, there were a number of St. John businessmen of my father's generation who were involved either with owning some movie theaters or distributors. Mitchell Franklin, Franklin Hirschhorn, they owned the Regent Theater. I don't know if you guys would remember that. There was a Mayfair Theater and a Regent Theater. I think the Mayfair Theater was where the Lord Beaverbrook Rink is today, and the Regent of the Mayfair was on Waterloo. And they were kind of seedy type of theaters. I didn't really go to those, but I think my older brother Joe went sometimes. But anyways, people like Izzy Davis, he was the distributor for United Artists. And Danny Elman, for many years, I think, distributed movies for one of the movie studios.
My uncle Abe Smith was distributor for MGM.
Right. There were a number of others in St. John as well. And Lou Michelson, who was a cousin of mine, also, I forget for which movie studio. So that's kind of interesting. Anyways, I'll begin my reading of the movie review, and I'm going to turn on a light because it's starting to get a little dark. And I'll put on my glasses. By the way, the Children of a Lesser God, the title is from if I remember, Alfred Tennyson poem, a famous poem called the Idylls of the King. And the Children of a Lesser God refers to, I think, second-class citizens. That's the origin of that term, by the way. Anyways, it's not every day I have the opportunity to review a major Hollywood film set in St. John. True, St. John is supposed to be a stand-in for a place in the state of Maine. That's why the Stars and Stripes is seen flying, road sign speed limits are in miles per hour, and American money is used as currency. But there's no mistaking the locale. That's the city of St. John up there on the screen. Netherwood School, numerous uptown streets, Jerry Koven's Fairville department store, the old El Belgrano restaurant, Beaver Harbor, the Bay of Fundy, Nave George's residence on Canterbury Street, even a shot of the pulp mill. All these places appear in the background of Children of a Lesser God, the film adaptation of the award-winning play and a love story set in the school for the deaf. The movie, which stars William Hurt as teacher James Leeds and Marley Matlin as the gutsy deaf woman Sarah Normans he falls in love with, has all the ingredients of the film likely to earn numerous Oscar nominations, which it did, by the way. It was nominated, I think, for 5 or 6 Oscars. However, trying to watch the background activity in this movie while at the same time keeping my attention on the main story was a bit of a challenge. Notwithstanding the local scenery, there were many familiar faces of St. Johners appearing on the screen as extras. There's the bearded Alan Francis playing the part of the waiter in the restaurant scene. Not to forget watching Monica Collins and Marcia Zed move around the dance floor later on in the sequence. Even my own brother Herzl loading up on his plate at the salad bar earlier in the same scene. Herzl was never one to miss a free meal. Just joking. Sorry for being unable to name every extra who appeared in this film, but there were dozens. Watching the background of this movie for familiar faces is something every St. Johner is going to do who attends the movie. Despite these distractions, the movie impressed me. It's an intense picture with many poignant scenes that had me on the verge of tears at times. It has many funny scenes. It also is a film which altered for the better my entire view of human speech and the way people communicate. Set in a contemporary school for children with impaired hearing, Children of a Lesser God deals sensitively with the relationship between the deaf woman, Sarah, and the teacher, James, who wants to help her function in the quote unquote hearing world. It's not your average Hollywood romance. A man from the hearing world in love with a woman who is deaf is fraught with deep problems. The movie explores this with considerable sensitivity. There are stirring scenes of love and confrontation between Hurt and Matlin, who try to bridge the gap, the communication gap, which separates them from each other's worlds. In this sense, Children of a Lesser God is really a story about communication. Ironically, it's Hurt who can't hear. At least in the metaphorical sense. Hurt makes everything he does so seem natural and effortless here, including the powerful when he tries to convey the music of Bach to Matlin in body language. But for our benefit, he simultaneously speaks his lines as well as verbally translating the sign language. As for Matlin, it'll be a big surprise if she doesn't earn a Best Actress nomination. Actually, she did earn it, and she did win the Best Actress awarded that year. She brings a potent combination of vulnerability and gutsy fire to her role. In a stirring performance using only sign language, Matlin makes us understand something about her world of silence, which is impossible for a hearing person to enter. Children of a Lesser God is a compelling movie. It will alter your view about speech, silence, and even love, and some of the scenes will stay in your mind for a long time. It's a rare sight in St. John to see people remain seated while the final credits roll by after the last fade out. Then again, it's not every day a major picture is filmed in St. John and which thanks the people of St. John in the credits, and a picture which could turn out to be the best movie of the year. Actually was nominated that year for Best Picture. The picture that won that year was Platoon, if I remember. You may remember the movie. It was a war picture, Platoon. Voila, the end.
Thank you.
I just wanted to add that I had no formal training as a film reviewer. So I don't know how I got the job. I guess I was a bit of a... and I don't think you really need to have formal training. I'm sure all of you, when you see a movie, when you leave the movie, you're like talking about it, what interests you, what didn't interest you, what you liked about it. It's a very common thing to do. So probably all of you could probably review movies.
But maybe not so well. But we did show Children of a Lesser God here in the synagogue last year. And I know I've watched it a couple of times. So we know that anyone from St. John who grew up here, who watches that film, I'm not sure if we even care about the love story. We're too busy saying, There's my house. There's that corner. How could they rename that? That's Jerry's store. And
Right.
on and on and on. And identifying people and pausing and going
Right.
back. I know
Right.
I watched it when I was at university, and probably half of the people in the room were from St. John. The other half were not. They actually were interested in the plot. I don't know why. We almost came to collective blows. It was an interesting experience.
That scene where Marley Maitland and Hurt are in the swimming pool, that swimming pool was in vocational school across the street or diagonally across the street from our house. And we knew that they were going to be filming there. And Marlene Fransbo and I tried to, I think it was Marlene, because she also lived in Douglas Avenue, tried to go into vocational school to see if we could see them, but it was all barred
Yeah, I
off.
remember that scene. Yeah.
Yeah.
There
May I
was
say something?
they used Nave George's residence on Canterbury Street. Remember Judge Nave George? They used his house, or he allowed them to use the house, and a lot of the interior shots. And there was I forget her name. There's a friend of mine from Beaver Harbor. There was some of the interior shots that were done in a nice house in Beaver Harbor, but there was a lot of local settings there. Netherwood School was certainly used a lot, and many streets in St. John. That was the fun part of watching the movie, recognizing the streets.
May I just say I've seen that film twice. The first time was just for the film. The second time, when I found out it was filmed in St. John, I went back to try to figure out the different locations. And having not lived in St. John for 25 years at that point, I didn't find anything, really. Can I say, I also want to ask, have there been any other major films that you know of that were filmed in St. John? I'll try again.
Not that I know of. There
Okay.
probably maybe, but not maybe some Canadian movies, but not Hollywood. This was a Hollywood movie.
Yeah, it's a beautiful film.
There was.
Okay, go ahead.
And now I just blanked out. But there was the film. Oh, Christ! It was shot at RCS and Netherwood about the poem. I keep thinking it's Liam Neeson, but I'm not sure about poetry, teaching poetry to high school students, and it was shot at RCS in Netherwood. And of course, when the program is over, I'll know exactly what the title is, who the director was, the year it was done, and everything that I cannot remember right now. But
You can send us an email.
It's not exactly St. John, but it was shot. It was shot at RCS.
I have something. Sorry to interrupt you. Are you finished? I didn't want to butt in.
Yes.
I have a couple of quick comments back about Children of Lesser God. My brother Andrew and I were in St. John when they were filming it. We didn't live there anymore, but for whatever reason. And we went over to watch in front of my father's store. And first thing that was really funny is, you'll all enjoy this. They were bringing in the big fog machines because they chose the location because they needed heavy fog for this. And, we're noted for that, obviously. The one day there's no fog, they had to bring in fog machines to St. John. We thought that was hysterical. And the second thing was, we were standing across the street watching from the store, and there were quite a few people. We had to move. So we and whoever else was around there turned around and went. There was a tavern there, so we went into the tavern. I had never been in there in my life. And my brother was embarrassed because I looked like I didn't know what was going on. But we had to sit down and order a beer because, what could we do? So we were watching out the window. And the third thing, which was, I don't know if my father would want me to tell this, but I think it's a great story, is that Marley Matlin, until then, was not known. That was her big break.
That's true.
So during the filming of that scene that was on Main Street West, all the stores, I guess the film crew had gone along and asked everybody for permission to change the signs and to be closed for such and such an amount of time and all that, so they could use the street. And apparently, this is not, I don't know this 100%, but this is what I heard at the time. They were all compensated for the time they had to close their businesses.
Really?
But my father was the only one who said, don't worry about the money. Just make sure that everything is, put back in place. As long as the store looks the same when you leave, go ahead, use it. This is exciting. And because he was so wonderful, and he loved Marley Matlin, by the way. She was in there. They all were in the store in and out during the time, and he got to interact with them. So that was really fun for him. And that's why he said, don't worry, that's enough, go ahead. And because of that, you may or may not have noticed this, Ancil, but when the scene focused on that street, all the other stores had signs that said something else, they renamed all the businesses, except there was this 2 or 3 second pause on my father's store, which still said Fairville Department Store. They left the sign up and they left it as is, which we assumed obviously was just a, kind of a fun thing.
That's free advertising.
Yeah. But it was fun, fun for him. He didn't get compensated with money. He didn't want it, but how exciting that his store was up there and moving.
I remember, just as an aside, I remember the hardwood floors of your father's store. They were very unique. You remember those? Remember that? They were very unique.
And the metal ceiling.
And the ceiling, yeah. Those were the days.
The good old days, yeah.
And it's so sad that building's no longer there, but it's been preserved on film.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll move on to the next reading. And this is where we're going to start subbing people in because the readings are a little bit shorter. I'm going to share something from Dan Elman. And Dan Elman's an interesting person. He studied at the University of New Brunswick in Fredericton. He went on to Dalhousie and then went on to the University of Fribourg in Switzerland, the Catholic University in Louvain in Belgium, and then on to the Jungian Institute in Zurich, Switzerland. I think he had aspirations of becoming a doctor, and because of the quotas that they had at Dalhousie University, he ended up going to Switzerland and to Belgium to complete his medical career, although as far as I know, he never practiced. He also spent a year in Saglec Bay, Labrador, working with the American Corps of Engineers. He was involved with film distribution with his father, Maury. And then he moved on to another career as an IT instructor and consultant for advanced training and for J.D. Irving. And there are still all kinds of people in this town who he showed how to use a computer. I'm raising my hand on one of them. He's also been the president of the congregation here in St. John, and he served for many years, about 2 decades, as the community's lay reader in lieu of a rabbi, so leading the Sabbath services, teaching the children for their bar and bat mitzvahs, and then conducting community outreach to anybody and everybody at all ages. He also coordinated the immigration committee that brought the Israeli families to St. John beginning in 2004. And of course, anybody who knew Dan knows that he was always up for a game of chess and that he was instrumental in the World Chess Festival that came to St. John in 1988. And somehow in between all of that, he found time to write a novel, which he called Centrum, which was set in Europe, a book of poetry called Enixam. And if you reverse the letters, it actually spells Maxine. So I think there was a lost love involved in that somewhere. And he also wrote a book about chess, because of course, you have to, because you're Dan Elman. Evolution of Chess Concepts, a program for scholastic chess. And he's also put together a series of lectures that were on Judaism in context. And if you go to the museum's YouTube page, you'll find some of those lectures there. So I did pick out the opening page or so of Enixam to read. And because none of the Elmans were available tonight, they're busy people, I've asked Rosalind Harouche, who is one of our museum volunteers, to read that for us.
I found myself upon an open plain outside of time, with space, the walls and roof. This I saw as a flame from within, illuminated all about. I, the star of this environment, freshly made to yield new spheres. The ground was flat, untrampled, and infinite. No rise, no fall. Space devouring all, and in the space a meaning, there unseen to be sought. The state of originality, old as I was young, for there was no movement, since time was eternal and space infinite, and this flame of awareness but a burning speck, just created and created just. A moment of blesses existence, whole and pure and innocent, yet of no form, not identity supposed, until a thought occurred, why am I here? This the initial movement sensed, came into the great stillness as a whisper, warning of the storm. In the beginning I was there, thence wandered over points, each of which was the moment. But as each point held no area, and as each moment endured no time, the motion of self was felt only in self, and there was no inertia for all existence, joined in the harmony of being. The plane extended as I approached its limits, so the ground on which I trod differed from the encompassing space only by its compactness, by the solidarity of whirling atoms. It seemed not important the direction I chose, yet was there a determined force which bade my impulse along a certain route, and I asked, what determines the direction I take? As if by answer, through magnanimous response, which would define into clearer signs my role, the great change occurred on the plane. Form grew passionately about me, and it did so in space and time. Dimension was added, reducing the plane and forming invisible bars, blocking the window of understanding through which I could peer, but not pass. I have to say, I read it many times, and I thought it was beautiful, right? Very poignant. So please read it, and I want to buy the book.
Thank you, Roz. I think the book's about 100 pages. I did read it. I don't know. It kind of went over my head, but I think that was just me. So here's another writer. Here's one who's no longer with us. So some of you may know the name Nathan Druskin. If you think of Druskin's store, as was on Dock Street, and then Union Street, and then into Brunswick Square. So Nathan Druskin was the son of Abraham and Nettie Druskin. And I found his brief obituary, which described him as a journalist, newspaper editor, freelance writer, speech writer, and university lecturer. So another one of these very diverse people. His newspaper career started in St. John with the Telegraph Journal and the Evening Times Globe. His byline appeared over general news stories, including at least one that documented the murder of Aaron Cohen, a Jewish shopkeeper who was shot by a robber late on a dark December night. He was a frequent contributor to a regular column, The Man on the Street, which focused on the lighter sides of the news, and he also wrote the Scouting column, which reported on the activities of the many different scout troops and leaders based in the city, including the Jewish one, by the way. Several human interest pieces about the city's people and places also appeared. During the Second World War, he went on to write for the Maple Leaf, a Canadian Army newspaper. And then after that, he went on to write for many popular publications, including Reader's Digest, which probably every family in Canada had in their house. And one of the stories that he wrote was published in 1986. And again, for anyone from St. John, everybody from St. John has heard of the skating hero, Charles Gorman. And so I've asked Janet Shore to read a little bit from his article, which was called The Legend of Lily Lake. And he wrote this 50 years after the fact, but clearly his own memory of what happened. So I will turn it over to you, Janet.
Thank you, Catherine, and to all the people that have read, all the authors, the stories, and everything's been so beautiful and inspiring. And I'm very honored to read this piece by, what was his name? Nathan Druskin. I'm come from away. So someone mentioned come from away. I'm come from away. And I must say that although I'm from away, the Jewish community here in St. John has been very welcoming and has fully accepted me. So thank you for that. It's still the biggest, most exciting sports event that ever happened in my hometown, and I can remember it as if it were yesterday. There, exactly 50 years ago on Lily Lake in St. John, New Brunswick, local hero Charles Gorman skated into immortality before 25,000 spectators, literally half the population of the old Loyalist city. Already a speed skater of international stature, Gorman had been a disappointing flop in the 1924 Winter Olympics at Chamonix, France. So, when the 1926 World Championships were scheduled for St. John, the public eagerly awaited his big test against Olympic champion Klas Thunberg of Finland and the American long-distance ace John O'Neill Farrell. The air was cold and damp on Thursday, January 28, 1926, the final day of the meet, but electric with excitement. Thunberg was doing poorly, and the fight for the overall world title was down to Farrell and Gorman. The schools had declared a half holiday, and my father took me to Lily Lake to see the last two races on which the final outcomes depended, the 440 yards and the 5 miles. Gorman zipped to victory in the 440. All I saw was a blur. I barely knew the race had started before everybody was on his feet, yelling with delight. The late afternoon light was fading and snow was beginning to fall when the 27 skaters took up position for the 30 laps around the lake. Strung out like an advancing column, they made their first majestic sweep past the grandstand. Just then, the weather worsened and the skaters were almost stopped by a blast of stinging snow on the backstretch. The leader set a slow pace and Gorman and Farrell both stayed well back in the early laps. After 3 miles, however, Farrell moved up while Gorman dropped right to the rear. With 1 mile to do in the growing dusk, Gorman was still far back. I was shivering now and thinking more about the weather than the race. Suddenly, I realized something was happening. People were shouting and yelling. With 2 laps to go, Gorman had begun to move. Bent double against the snow-laden wind, he passed skater after skater. You could feel the ripple of excitement in the throngs around the lake. All at once, the crowd in the grandstand rose with a roar. With 1 lap left, Gorman passed Farrell and shot into the lead. Unleashing a furious sprint, he crossed the finish line first and fell, a panting, exhausted champion of the world. I can still hear, like a distant echo, the pandemonium that broke loose at Lily Lake that afternoon at twilight. I think it's written so well, and I feel like I was there.
Exactly. And we have 2 poems to round out the night. The first one is by Vernon Acker. Now, the Acker family were from St. Stephen. Vernon Acker went on to graduate from UMB in 1949. And one of his awards was the Bliss Carman Memorial Scholarship. So perhaps the poetry follows quite naturally from that. He started his career in St. John as a reporter for CHSJ Radio, and then joined General Motors Theatre, a group that presented radio plays. At the age of 30, he moved to England and had a long career with the BBC. He wrote hundreds of unpublished poems over the course of his life. It seems like a lot of his scenes were love, mostly lost love, and observations of the world around him. Some of them he gathered together into books, others were unsorted, and some of them are really only handwritten drafts that I still haven't quite made sense of. I've asked another of our museum volunteers, Paulette Gadet, to read one of his poems.
And yet, O Lord, I'd give my freedom up, by Vernon Acker. I cannot help but chide love ill-advised, although it is not spurious. I cannot help but smile when to confide, although I know love's serious. I cannot help but think of waster time, already thin small fissures seem. I cannot help but think of wasted prime, of days that soil, become unclean. And yet, O Lord, I'd give my freedom up for one more day of loose-limbed love, for one more day of full, high, brimming cup of heart that leaps and soars above. I envy you, O lass, who said this morn, your lover ended days alone. Your lover came like peace that followed storm, and breathed life beat into the stone.
And the last author that we'll look at tonight is Anne Selby. She was the daughter of Rachel Selby. She studied English and journalism at the University of Western Ontario. As a student, she wrote short stories for university publications and participated in theater, on stage, and behind the scenes mostly. When she was home on summer vacations, she wrote human interest stories for the Evening Times Globe and the Telegraph Journal. From 1957 to 1969, she was employed by Bell Telephone Publications in Montreal and wrote a weekly column called The Grab Bag, a lighthearted commentary on topics of general interest. She then moved on to a career at the Stratford Festival in Stratford, Ontario in 1969 until her untimely death in 1986. And at the time of her death, she was director of communications. So she was making contact with the writers, the directors, the actors, the editors, and the staff of other theater and opera and concert companies across Canada and around the world. She was working on design work for the publications, and she also trained people to take on some of her role. And there weren't a lot of pieces in the St. John newspaper, but I did find a poem that she wrote and had printed in the Telegraph Journal on June the 26th, 1952. So I'm going to ask Laurie Cohen-Hackett to come up and read Reflections.
Hi, just before I read this, I just want to thank everybody who's come tonight, and I want to thank all of the readers. It's been a wonderful evening, and thank you, Catherine, for putting this all together. So this is the last poem of the evening, and what better way to end it than to talk about love? So this is called Reflections. A young bride nervously whispering, I do. Do you remember, dear? That bride was you. A young groom fidgets with his coat and tie. Do you remember, dear? That groom was I. We have traveled by a well-known road, one that's paved with sorrows, joy, and all told. A mixture, mellow blend of bright and night, and through it all, a feeling of the right. For we have built a dwelling, just we two, palace built of love, in which we knew the happiest moments, cast away the gloom, heartily welcomed happiness to our room. But sometimes, dear, came fears and sometimes tears, to balance with the joy throughout the years. We met our tears and fears as we met joy, hand clasped in hand, in love, a girl and boy. And now a quarter century has gone by. We're still together always, you and I. And I pray to God whose glories are e'er sung. Thank you.
Okay. Well, that's it. So I'd like to thank all of our readers, Diane and Sandra and Jan and Harry and Cheryl and Ancil and Rosalind and Janet and Paulette and Lori. So I hope the words that we've heard tonight inspire you to learn more about the writers, to search for their works, published and unpublished, and perhaps soon to be published. Well, I think on that note, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us on Zoom, in person, and all the rest of it. For those of you in Zoom, I'm sorry I can't offer you any cookies. You'll have to raid your own kitchens. But we do have cookies and water at the back here and some books for sale for anyone who's interested. If you have any other questions or if you want to find a book, you can just send me an email at the museum and I'll see what I can do. If you happen to be near Ottawa, we can probably, or in Montreal, we can probably arrange delivery, depending on what you choose. So I'd like to thank everybody and I'll say good night.